Good afternoon, all. Spring is finally with us after arguably one of the most difficult years we've had. We're in the midst of a pandemic that has had a brutal impact on our lives. And two, we've experienced some acts of violence against ourselves and our sacred, in a secular way, capital. But despite all that darkness, spring has come and brought with us a dear friend who brings with him always a ray of sunshine, a light shining on one of the many thoughts and experiences and people, real and created, that he carries with him. Introducing Jay Parini reminds me of a vignette I heard years ago. I may have mentioned it before. An art history professor at Oberlin College was asked by a student, "Who is Picasso?" She instantly replied, "You can't pin him down. He's not a dead butterfly." And so I'd say the same about Jay Parini, poet, novelist, biographer, film producer, and I would add, patriot. Born in Pittston and reared in Scranton, he managed to escape into the big world via graduate school at St. Andrews in Scotland. Another story, and that's another story. Today, he will give us an insight into a trip he once took with the world-renowned Argentinian poet Jorge Borges. He had the incredible opportunity to travel with his genius in a completely, sometimes all too personal way. This was not in fancy hotels or universities. It was on the road in a not too fancy car and with full responsibility for this important man. As is his wont, the experience became a book, Borges and Me, My Travels in the Highlands of Scotland with a Literary Genius. So let's hear about that from Jay.
Thank you, Sandra. So Sandra, you're going to mute yourself.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Oh, wait, there we go. Okay. Well, hello, everybody. I'm delighted to be back at the Schemel Forum. I've been a very regular guest. Sandra is a very old friend of mine going back, I don't know, 50 years or more. And my time in Scranton actually goes back to, I was born in Pittston, 1948. And at the age of 4, my family moved to West Scranton, where I grew up on Rebecca Avenue. I went to the high school there in West Scranton High School, and which was famous at the time for its football player, Cosmo Iacovazzi, who was an amazing figure whom I had watched play many times when I was a kid. I went on from there to Lafayette College in Pennsylvania. And from Lafayette, I moved on. I went to my junior year abroad to the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, partly because of a young Irish architect who's a friend of Sandra Meyer's as well, Richard Pierce. Richard Pierce was living in Scranton, working as an architect, and I happened to bump into him. And I was fascinated to meet somebody from Northern Ireland. And he was studying at the Edinburgh School of Design and talked to me about Scotland. And I said to him, you know, I would love to study somewhere like Scotland. And he suggested that I study at the University of St. Andrews. So I had never heard of St. Andrews. I looked it up. It was this rather, at the time, obscure. It's no longer obscure since Prince William went there. And the Queen Mother went there actually as well. But it was known for kind of British aristocrats for the most part. It's the oldest university in Scotland. It's now very highly ranked. I'm quite amazed by how it's risen up in the world. But to me, it was in a completely unknown place in 1968 when I applied to St. Andrews and was accepted and got in. And so I went on my junior year abroad there, and it was revelatory. I was so amazed by everything that I saw. It was just somehow not Scranton. In every way, it was not Scranton. The teas and cakes. My tutorials were with eccentric dons, as they called the professors, in their offices. And it was the Oxford-Cambridge system where you would go to your tutor and you would read an essay aloud. And that's how it worked. You went to big lectures and heard lectures, wonderful lecturers. I was quite amazed by the people I encountered. And so when I went back, then I went back and did my senior year at Lafayette. And it was during the time of the Vietnam War. I had several friends who went off to Vietnam from Westside High School and who didn't fare very well there, I must confess. One of them was killed. And two of them really had a very, very, very bad time of it. And so I needed to get out of the country. I had no choice. My draft board kept sending me these rather provocative letters, shall we say, and I thought, I'm going to get drafted. So I just said, I'm out of here. So I took off for St. Andrews. I wrote to the professor there who had the English department and asked him if I could come and get into the graduate program, and I got in. So I went to St. Andrews for graduate school, 1970. And so checked in, got an apartment in a little godforsaken building, a basement damp apartment, and started working on in the graduate program with this Professor Faulkner. He was a strange man, shall we say. I write about him in my book, Borges and Me, which isn't just about Borges, it's mostly about me and my experience in Scotland. And it's really, how even to describe this book, it's the one book I've ever written which I can't actually categorize. It keeps, many people call it a road novel, and I've kind of accepted the fact that it's a novel. I mean, the dialogue is 100% made up, except for bits and pieces I can remember, bits or pieces that were in my diaries from the time, but very little. I take a very thin experience and turn it into a novel, a very fat novel. Well, not fat, it's about 250, 300 pages. But as I said, it's really an imagined version of my life in Scotland 50 years ago. I think of it, when I first wrote it, I called it a novel, and I called myself Luke Palermo. And then my editor said, Jay, these people are real people, and this is kind of based on your own experience, isn't it? I said, yeah, it is. He said, well, let's just call it a novelized memoir or autofiction. So that's what I call it, autofiction, which is actually a very popular genre these days, books that straddle fact and fiction. If I were to do this just purely as fact, I would have had a very thin book indeed, because I didn't have a tape recorder on me and I wasn't recording all my experiences. So I had to imagine the scenes. And for texture and form, I had certain authors in mind. I was thinking largely of Evelyn Waugh. If you've read any early novels by Evelyn Waugh, such as Decline and Fall, kind of short scenes, witty exchanges of dialogue, a very acerbic tone, sometimes, but very, very, very funny. And these stories actually are truly sometimes amazingly funny. For instance, some of them, remember this really happened. I was crossing the quadrangle in St. Andrews after I was in graduate school for about 3 years. And I ran into my advisor, Professor Faulkner, who was a very strange man. He was rather shriveled. He had a huge hat, which he always had to hold on to because the wind was blowing. He lived with his sister. He was a bachelor. He'd been a commander of a naval vessel during the war, and he still was living in World War II, as far as I could tell. And he stopped me in the quadrangle one day and he said, come here, come here. I said, yes, Professor, what can I do for you? He said, listen, there's a young man. This is a scene from Borges and Me, which is a scene from my memory as well. He said, there's a young man I want you to meet. He writes poetry and he's from America. I think you guys would get along. I said, oh, I'd love to meet him. He said, well, come for tea next Wednesday at 4 p.m. and I'll introduce you. I said, oh, good, I'll be there. And he gave me his address. And I said, what is the name of this young man? He said, oh, his name is Jay Parini. And I said, but Professor, I'm Jay Parini. He said, oh dear, are you really? He said, oh. He said, do you have 2 jackets? I said, well, I probably have 3 jackets. He said, oh, well, come for tea anyway. So I went for tea with myself. It was rather hilarious. So I was always having these kind of surreal experiences in St. Andrews. One of my tutors, Miss Wright, and I describe her in the book as a kind of, she was a Jean Brodie figure, a bit like Maggie Smith in that film about Jean Brodie. And she said to me, Mr. Parini, what do you want to be when you finish St. Andrews? I said, I hope to be a poet. She said, then you must meet Alistair Reid. Alistair Reid I'd never heard of, but he was a Scottish poet who was living in a little cottage he called Pilmore Cottage, right on the beach, about a mile outside of town. And so she picked up the phone immediately and said, Alistair, you must meet this young man, Jay Parini. He wants to write poetry. I could hear a silence on the end of the line. It's the last thing Alistair really wanted. And she said, you must meet him. I insist. He said, all right, well, tell him to meet me in the Central Tavern tomorrow at noon, and we'll have a little drink. And so I met him the next day in the Central Tavern in St. Andrews. And we had this amazing, I was so impressed by him. He had a remarkable way of talking. Everything he said was crisp and interesting. And he told me about when he had been a young man graduating from St. Andrews right after the war. He had fought in World War II in the Navy, Royal Navy. He wrote a letter to Robert Graves, the poet, on the Isle of Majorca, and said that he wanted to meet him and show him his poems. He was coming to Spain. And so Graves wrote back and said, listen, you mentioned in your letter that you have a degree in Latin from St. Andrews. Could you help me? I'm translating Suetonius' Lives of the Noble Caesars for Penguin Books. Maybe you could help me by being my secretary for a bit and doing a rough translations, and then I'll refine them. Alistair immediately seized on this. He moved to Majorca, lived in a little house on the property near the beach in Deya, and that's the name of the village, and had this extraordinary experience of learning to write, sitting right next to Robert Graves. Alistair would bring his translations, and Graves, he thought they were really in perfect English, and Graves would sit down and correct him. And Alistair would see paragraphs moved around. He would see passive constructions turned into active constructions. He would see adjectives absorbed into much better nouns, and he would see adverbs disappearing and absorbed into much better verbs. And just in so many ways, his writing just shot through the roof. So Alistair said, listen, if you want, bring me some of your poems for tea. Come for tea next week on an appointed time and the Pilmore Cottage, and I will correct your poems. So I went out there for tea, and I sat at the kitchen table with all these jam pots around us and Alistair's 8-year-old son running around screaming. There was no woman in the picture as far as I could tell, and there never was. And Alistair would, just cross out words, move stanzas, and change things. And he said, come back next week, and next week, and the next week. And I kept coming back. And that was my creative writing workshop, my happy, amazing accident of being introduced to Alistair Reid, who then became a lifelong friend. He only died a couple of years ago, nearly 90 years old, and we never were out of touch, I don't think 1 week in 45 years. We talked on the phone. He frequently came to Vermont and stayed with me, often for 2-3 months at a time. He lived for periods in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, and I would go down there with my wife and kids. He lived for 15 years in the Dominican Republic in the Samana Peninsula, and he lived in like Robinson Crusoe in a hand-built cottage right on the beach. He collected rainwater in a cistern for his water. Sunlight came onto a light panel and powered his electric devices. Otherwise, he had an outhouse, and he lived very primitively. He kept a few chickens, and he had a vegetable garden. He was a remarkable man, nothing like Alistair in my life. And he was himself a brilliant poet and essayist, but he was mainly a translator of Latin American poetry and fiction. He had early translated Pablo Neruda, and the best translations of Pablo Neruda, the great Chilean poet, are by Alistair. And he very early translated the stories and poems of Jorge Luis Borges, the great Argentinian fabulist, who was one of the founders of magic realism. And one day he said, Borges is coming to visit me from Argentina. And so I describe all this in the book. And he said, I need you to help me because I can't drive and we need to chauffeur Borges around a bit. And so I agreed to operate in the category of chauffeur. And so Borges arrived, and in the course of events, I drove him around on 2 or 3 journeys, usually with Alistair, one journey by myself over to Inverness, which I've built up into this novel, Borges and Me. But there were extraordinary, the trip to Inverness, Alistair was supposed to go with us, and something went wrong, and I wound up going by myself, much to my terror, in this beat up old Morris Minor that I had, which had the floorboards were so threadbare that you almost see the road underneath the car. Remember, Borges was blind and elderly, and it was very strange traveling with him, but he was a walking encyclopedia of literature and philosophy. He had memorized so many things. Everything was in his mind. He had been, for a career, a librarian. He was the national librarian of the university, national librarian of the country of Argentina in Buenos Aires for many years. And, he had memorized so much Spanish literature. He could quote vast tracts of poetry in Spanish and in English. His grandmother actually was English. English was as much his first language as Spanish. And he read deeply. He could quote Shakespeare till the cows come home. But he also had an eccentric anthology of favorite writers. He said to me, "Oh, well, you're an English specialist, I see." Alistair tells me. I said, "Yes." He said, "Then you must read the great ones." I said, "Oh, well, I do. I read Shakespeare and Milton." He said, "Yes, they're great, but you should read Robert Louis Stevenson and G.K. Chesterton." And he said, "And then there's the great Chidiock Titchborne." I said, "Who the hell is Chidiock Titchborne?" He said, "Oh, he died around 1599. He was beheaded in the Tower of London, and he said he only wrote one poem, an elegy for himself, and he quoted it. And it is a beautiful poem, but a completely unknown writer. I quote the poem in my book. And Borges and I took off. One time we went down to. He wanted to visit the village near St. Andrews, where Robinson Crusoe lived. Robinson Crusoe was the name of a local Scot by the name of Alexander Selkirk. We went down there and looked at the place, wandered around. Actually, I say looked at. Borges was blind, and at one point he said, "I want to go see this and that." I said, "Well, Borges, you're blind." I said, I stupidly, as a 21-year-old. He said, "Don't tell me you're blind as well." I said, "No, I'm not blind." He said, "Then you will be my eyes." So good. Okay, big responsibility. And I think I learned a great deal from that little experience. I remembered so vividly, for many years, I told stories about meeting Borges. I mean, one of my favorite was when we went down to this little hotel south of St. Andrews in near the Robinson Crusoe home. And we went to the Robinson Crusoe Hotel and Tavern. And Borges, I said, "Borges, what will you drink?" He said, "Oh, I don't really drink, but well, I'll have typical Scottish beer." So I brought him a pint of Export. It's called Export. And I put this big pint in front of Borges, and he suddenly began to stir it with his finger and then lick his finger. I thought, oh my God, this is ridiculous. And I was getting very impatient with him. I actually, frankly, had never heard of Borges before I met him. And I said to him, "Mr. Borges." "No, mister, just call me Borges." "Okay, Borges." He said, I said, "Alistair tells me, Borges, that you're a writer." He said, "Oh, Alistair exaggerates." I said, "So you're not a writer?" He said, "Oh, I write these little stories, little fictions, few poems." And I became very dismissive. I thought he was a novelist, and I'm thinking, okay, no novels. I said, "You've never written a novel?" "No." I said, "Borges, did you ever want to write a novel?" He said, "Jay, want to write a novel?" He said, "My whole life I dreamed of writing a great novel of the Argentine plains, the Pampas. And there would be gauchos on horseback, and there would be prostitutes, and there would be wars and rumors of wars." He said, "Generations would rise and fall, would rise and fall. there would be matricide and fratricide, and worst of all, patricide. And I said, oh dear. So what happened to this novel? He said, Jay, for month after month, year after year, decade after decade, I dreamed of this great book. I could see it in my head, but I never wrote a word of it. Then one day, a miraculous morning, I woke up and I went to my desk and I wrote a 200-word review of this novel, and that satisfied the impulse. So that was like, I thought this was just charming beyond description. And I just feel like I learned so much from Borges. I remember at one point he said to me, Alistair says you write poems. Do you write poems? I said, yes, I do. I'm trying. He said, well, let me hear one of your poems, please, please. Well, I was embarrassed, but I always carried my notebook with me. I never go very far without my notebook. Even to this day, I have my notebook. And I pulled it out and I said, well, here's a poem. It's a love poem to a young woman who is resisting my charms. And he said, read it to me, read it to me. I read him the poem. He said, ah, yes. He said, I wrote the same poem once. I said, well, you wrote a poem something like this, Yearning for a Young Woman. He said, no, 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 Jay, you misunderstood me. I said, I wrote exactly the same poem, only in Spanish. I said, I've never read your poems. He said, doesn't matter. He said, we're all copying from the same mystical sources. And literature is like that. And he said, you must read an essay I've written about how we're always just rewriting the classics. He has a wonderful short story essay called Pierre Maynard, author of the Quixote, which talks about this. So Borges' view of literature was that, the classics are all around us. He said, a classic is a book, Jay. He asked me about if I'd read Don Quixote. I said, I'm afraid not. He said, well, you will read it one day with a great sense of remembrance. I said, not remembrance. I've never read it. He said, Jay, no, you're misunderstanding me. A classic is a book that we don't have to read to understand. It's there in the culture, and we read it with a sense of remembrance. He said the greatest storyteller, of course, is Scheherazade from 1001 Nights. And I said, Borges, who wrote 1001 Nights? He said, I did. I said, you did? He said, yes, I wrote all the classics, and it so annoys my contemporaries. So you see, he was full of these endless witticisms and charm. And, he really just taught me so much in our brief time together. And in some ways, I would say that, I only had a few days with Borges, really, in my life. And yet, he made such a profound impression on me, telling me when I described the Scottish landscape to be specific. He said, you must be very, very, very specific. We're driving along and I would see Borges said, so Jay, you're my eye. What do you see? I said, well, I see the sea and there are some birds and there are some trees and there's some flowers. And he said, that's not the way a writer talks. You don't tell me you see the sea and birds. You see, a cobalt colored sea. You're seeing gannets flying in the air. You're seeing cormorants on the water. What are these flowers? It's springtime. Are you seeing daffodils? What's going on? Give me details. Give me colors. Be concrete. Be visual. That's your work, is to envision the world. That's the work of the author. That's the work of the poet. That's the work of the prophet, to envision the world. That's your very hard work. And so, so he really, so that's what I tried to do. And certainly in Borges and Me, I tried to really envision the world. We're driving through the Highlands, and let me just read a paragraph. We churned upward in my lowest gear on a steep patch some miles from Aviemore. I paused by the side of the narrow road to take in the Cairngorm Mountains with a mental gasp, range after range, with a purple and yellow mist girdling them midway, their peaks many-faceted, glinting. Glens and corries, those deep pits in the rolling landscape, darkened in the distance. The hills bathed in the gold light of late afternoon. I saw below us an isolated stand of pines, like an unshaven clump of hair on a man's cheek. Deer loped in the field below in a dip in the road, moving through panels of bronze light, and the sight of them affected me strongly. The world was unspeakably beautiful as well as strange. And I think I got that from talking to Borges and reading Borges and thinking about him. I did a conversation like this with some people a few weeks ago, and somebody said to me afterward, well, how did you in only like a week with or in the company of Borges altogether get so much about him and know so much about him, and could he have been such an influence on you? And I said, well, this is the influence of a great writer. And I said, yes, I had very little time with him, but I got a sense of him physically and the way he talked. But then I started reading Borges, and I've spent 50 years reading his amazing short stories, reading his poetry, reading his essays, the way he blends fact and fiction, which is the main primary thing that Borges does, is he takes a short story and turns it into an essay, or he takes a literary criticism essay and turns it into a short story. He's always messing with the genres. I so vividly remember him telling me he'd just been to Israel, and he said, you walk into an Israeli bookshop, and he said, as he did, he said, where are the novels? And they said, oh, we don't separate in Hebrew fiction and nonfiction. We have a category, siporet, which means narrative. And there was a whole wall where books of narrative were located. And so he was very keen on the notion of narrative and getting beyond fact and fiction and thinking about making something true, not worrying about fact and fiction. I really learned a great deal. His quirky way of talking was immensely influential, but then I started reading him and teaching him. I've taught Borges here at Dartmouth College and Middlebury College year after year after year. I've taught his stories and poems, and I've just gotten so much from it. After Borges left St. Andrews and he went back to Argentina, a couple years later, I published my first volume of poems. I called myself in those days Jay Parini. And that was on the name, the only book of mine that has that name on it, the Lee, in my middle name. I'm rather pretentiously on the cover. And I sent the book to Borges in Argentina. Alistair had given me the address. And I heard nothing back. Then I got about 3 years later, suddenly I was teaching at Dartmouth, in my second year at Dartmouth, I think by this time. This is about 1976 or 7. A book arrived in the mail from Borges saying, see page 97 or something. And I turned to it, and there's a story called Gradus ad Parnassum, the steps up Parnassus, that begins, I'm going to criticize an essay by the literary critic Jay Parini, the eminent Dartmouth professor, who writes about Ginsberg in the New York Review of Books, and he quotes a long passage and says, he said, as usual, Parini, in his way, understands everything except the true and weighty volume, marrow of the volume in question. I was so shocked. Borges was sort of having some fun with me and really enjoying it. And so I always tell people, he put me into a work of fiction well before I put him into a work of fiction. In many ways, I'm just having my own back on him after that story appeared. And for 50 years, believe me, so since 1977, people write to me every year, at least once a year, saying, Professor Parini, I've searched the archives of the New York Review of Books, and I have never found your essay on Ginsberg. And I really must read it. And I always say, well, I never wrote an essay on Ginsberg in the New York Review of Books. Borges was completely making that up. He was having some fun. And so Borges so what I tried to do, when I get on the road with Borges and Me, pretty soon we move into the world, the phantasmagorical world of Borges, the world of magic realism. For instance, Borges had certain places he wanted to see. He was very keen to visit, not too far from St. Andrews, Scone Palace, where Macbeth had been crowned king. Still there. And it's got a labyrinth of hedgerows out back that interested him. And so we got there, the place was locked up tight, but we were able to walk through on a very, very misty day through the box hedges of a labyrinth. And Borges was obsessed with labyrinths. In fact, his selected short stories was simply called Labyrinths, the selected short stories of Borges. And as we were coming out of the hedgerows in the mist, a woman started shrieking at us in some strange, thick Scottish accent. And Borges said, the weird sisters are here. And the weird sisters, of course, appear in Shakespeare and Macbeth. And so in Borges and Me, I create three weird sisters like in Shakespeare. And they present us with a series of riddles. Borges was obsessed with riddles. And so these riddles play out in the course of my narrative. So you can see how this book is a little bit constructed that way. In fact, one of the targets of our journey was, the main reason I was on this one particular journey driving Borges was he wanted to meet a man in Inverness by the name of Mr. Singleton, who was editing a volume. He had written to Borges from in Argentina, saying he was editing a volume of riddles, Anglo-Saxon riddles. And Borges was interested, and Borges had his phone number in his pocket. So we drove to Inverness. Borges refused to call the man ahead. He said, I want to surprise him. It's always the best way. We got to Inverness and I called the number and the operator said, I'm afraid that this number is not a Scottish telephone number. It's a number for Inverness. True, the operator told me, but it's Inverness in New Zealand. So I had to go back to Borges and said, I'm afraid there's a terrible mistake, Borges. This man you're looking for is actually in Inverness, New Zealand. And he said, well, Jay, I won't have you ask you to drive me there. Much relieved by that. So we drove back to St. Andrews, stopping as he wished at the battlefield at Culloden. He was very obsessed with military history. His own grandfather had been a warrior in some classic battle. And so he was very interested in all of this. And there was some strange men playing bagpipes and running around there, and they were sort of primitive versions of war reenactors. So I was able to really play this up in the book and have fun with it. So it also gave me an opportunity to think about the war in Vietnam, and all different kinds of things. So I was able to play all this out in the book. Interesting. How did this book arise? Many people have asked me. I never thought I was going to write a book about my little car journey with Borges, two or three journeys. But I was sitting in Italy, southern Italy, 3 years ago. I was making a film with, alas, Kevin Spacey about Gore Vidal. I had been Gore Vidal's biographer, and I wrote a screenplay with a film director called Michael Hoffman, based on the life of Gore Vidal. And Kevin Spacey was playing Gore Vidal. So I was in Italy for the whole 4 months of the shoot. I was actually on the set for every single take. And I was sitting in a cafe in a small seaside village, and very small village in southern Italy, south of Amalfi. And, lots of movie people visit sets. Actors would turn up, directors and so forth, friends of the filmmakers. And I was having lunch with Andy Patterson, who was the director of the film, the Gore film, and Ross Clark, who had recently just had his second or third movie produced, and he was a film director, Englishman. And Ross pulled out of his backpack Labyrinth by Borges, the selected stories. And I said, do you like Borges? He said, do I like Borges? He's the only writer I ever really like to read. I read Borges over and over. I said, well, so do I. I said, can I tell you a little story? I once met him in Scotland and took him on a little bit of a road trip and started telling him some of these stories I've just been telling you here on Zoom. And he was just startled listening to me. He said, my God, you met Borges? And so forth, and you know so much about him. And Andy Patterson's ears are pricked up. And Ross said, Jay, this would make a great film. We'll call it Borges and Me, because Borges is a famous story, Borges and I. And I said, Well, let me think about it. Let me see if I can come up with some notes about my time in Scotland and with Borges. So when I went back to Vermont after the filming stopped, I started writing, and I wrote, 300 and some pages quickly, like within 4 months. It all came pouring out. I called it a novel at first and changed my name. As I said, I called myself Luke, and sent it to Ross and Andy. And they said, yes, we'll make this movie. Let's do the screenplay. And so we worked on the screenplay. And I was back and forth, back and forth. They were coming to Vermont. I was going to London, meeting with them, and we're still back and forth. We're planning to make the movie. In fact, it's out to the screenplay is completed, and it's out to casting right now. So I can't tell you whom, but various actors, well-known actors, are reading it. And so we hope to make that movie. Andy has done many movies. He did The Girl with Pearl Earring and The Railway Man and so forth, many films. So I've been involved in the last years practically as much with the film industry as with the literary and teaching industries, shall we call them. It's been rather exciting. Ever since I started working on The Last Station back in 1990 with the great actor Anthony Quinn. And he and I co-wrote several versions of the screenplay of my novel, The Last Station, which is about the last days of Leo Tolstoy. And so I kind of cut my teeth working with Anthony Quinn there and writing scripts. And, I've written several since. I've got another one, which I've just finished, based on my novel, Benjamin's Crossing, which is about Walter Benjamin, who was a Jewish intellectual chased by the Nazis over the Pyrenees in 1940. And when he was caught, he committed suicide. It's quite a moving story. And he was taken over the mountains by a young woman called Lisa Fitko. And I met her in old age, and when she was in her old age, and interviewed her at great length about this journey. And so it's a story about the novel, and the film is really about Lisa Fitko meeting Benjamin and taking him over the mountains and many other refugees over the mountains. So I've been working on that too, all these projects rather simultaneously. So why don't I open this up for questions? I don't want to go on too long. I know what Zoom fatigue feels like since I've been teaching on Zoom for the past year, and I never like to go more than an hour. And now we've got 12:41, so that should leave us 20 minutes in which I can answer any questions that anybody might have. And I would ask Allison to really keep an eye out on the screen here and let people, and be sure to unmute yourself and then ask your question or make your comment and then mute yourself again, okay? And Allison, will you be the kind of controller of that for us?
Sure. Who wants to start?
Don't be shy. I'm not shy.
Let's see.
There's Sandra's got her hand up anyway. I can see.
Okay. All right, Sandra, you're up.
Sandra can
Okay,
stand up.
well, it's a very shy group, really. You'll find that out. And of course, I'm kidding. But I'm kind of fascinated with nonfiction novels. I don't know if it's exactly a genre or it just slips into an author's habit of fictionalizing or making a novel out of a lot of things that have happened in his or her life.
Mhm. Yes, I think.
So just
let me talk about
tell
that.
me a bit about it.
Okay. And then mute yourself again, Sandra, so we don't have, there we go. It's a very complicated genre. The truth is many novels are autobiographical novels. I'm thinking of D.H. Lawrence, Sons and Lovers, and, James Joyce, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. They're practically taken straight from the lives of these authors. But, how do you take history and fiction and work them together? I was fascinated in 1970 or 68 with Norman Mailer's book, which is History as a Novel, the Novel as History. What's it called? Armies of the Night? Yes. And so I was really and certainly if you're writing about Borges, he invites you to think about the differences between fact and fiction. And this was clearly a book I could not write unless I was able to do it as a kind of novel. But it's a kind of novel that's based on my real experiences. I'm talking about Professor Faulkner and Alistair Reed and his son Jasper. I talk about Scranton and my parents. I talk about Lafayette College, talk about Borges, talk about various friends. A friend of mine writing to me, a Scranton buddy from West Side, is writing me letters from Vietnam. And so I quote a bunch of these letters and that kind of thing. So I just thought, well, I'm not going to worry about genre. I'm going to just let this play out in my imagination, however it falls. And I've been very pleased by the result. I mean, most readers seem willing to take it for what it is and really seem to like it. They read it as a story. It is a story based on fact, based on true events. How many movies have you seen based on true events, right? So that's really what this is, a road novel based on true events. Does that help, Sandra, a little bit? I can't hear you, Sandra.
Oh,
Okay. Anyone else? There's a hand up there, or Mary or somebody else?
Let's see. I see Will. I'm going to have you unmute, Will. There you go. There you
Hi.
go.
On your travels,
Yes.
on your road trip,
Yeah.
whether it happened or didn't happen, how would you and your esteemed co-writer look at the dimensions of hope, the Library of Babel, and I'll leave it at that.
The dimensions of hope. Well, in many ways, Borges was a remarkably cheerful man. And here he was dealing with a lifetime of blindness, dealing with the fact that he had been kicked out of his job. He told me, he said, I was demoted from being professor of poetry at the University of Buenos Aires to head of the Department of Poultry, chickens, by the Perón government. His own mother and cousins and uncle were arrested by Perón. He had dealt with an incredibly oppressive regime. So he had a profound sense of the difficulties of life and how, he himself had persevered by calling on the imagination. He said this to me again and again. He said, what we do is we summon the imagination and we summon our realities and declare them pure. And this really saves us. And I find his poems very inspiring and hopeful, and he had a kind of a marvelous sense of the world and a rich sense of the world. I mean, there's a sense of all time being present in Borges simultaneously. I mean, there's no sense when he writes about Shakespeare and Spinoza and Immanuel Kant and Milton as contemporaries. And there's a sense that everybody is at some great table in a great literary conversation. And this is all intelligent and fun and well-meaning and good, high-spirited. And I think that he communicated, there was something about his sense of the world, view of the world, that very, very distinct and communicated itself in person really vividly. And so I think that really was transformative for me. And Alistair had that as well. I could see that Alistair's view of the world had been tremendously influenced by his friendship and reading of Borges and his encounters with Borges. And then I had 50 years of encounters with Alistair, which have been for me utterly transformative. I would be nowhere without Alistair Reed, my great teacher. So it's also inspired me as a teacher in my own life. I've been teaching now for 50 years. And so I'm very used to, having students and feeling like I can make a difference here. I can give them a view of the world, a magical view of the world. I can make them excited about books and people and ideas and give them a sense of the simultaneity of all time and cultures. And so we get to learn about things and not feeling like it's alien to read about Homer or Sophocles or Dante. Also Borges was a great scholar of Dante. And, I've been spending my life reading the same books Borges was reading, trying to come to terms with them. Dante's great Divine Comedy. Does that help, Will? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well,
I see Tony, Janice, I see your hand is up. So let me call on Tony first and then we'll go to Janice. So Tony, can you unmute?
Thank you, thank you. I'm sorry, my video is not working. But Jay, I am originally from Scranton, and I have been hearing from my very dear friend Sandra Myers about you for many years. So now I'm actually hearing you, and I am thrilled to be on this podcast. There is an author she's a romance novelist. It's insignificant, her name. Through her, I began to love Scotland. Both present day and past day. And when you were talking about your friend Borges, you don't have to know Scotland. You don't have to, I know Scotland. I've never been there, but I feel like I can walk into any scenario and fit right into Scotland. I'm just obsessed with Scotland. As a matter of fact, I'm watching this TV series called The Outlander.
yeah, I know it.
I love it. And I don't like scientific time travel things, but I love this. I really love this TV series. But I wanted to ask you, I have a very dear friend. Her name is Rachel Benavie, and her father is Howard Fast.
Oh, yeah.
Did you know him at all?
Howard Fast was his son, Jonathan,
Yes.
married one of my best friends,
Erica Jong. Yes.
Erica Jong. So Erica Jong and is still a very close friend of mine. We talk all the time. And so she's talked about Howard Fast a lot of the time. And I met Jonathan Fast and so forth. So I know all about him.
Because when I have read several of his novels, and before I knew Rachel, all I knew was, Spartacus. Right. And I've read several of his novels, and I find so very much the wave of thought that he presents to the reader. I'm feeling that in your voice. So I am very much now going to go out and get myself some of your books. And thank you for being here.
Well, Scotland is still a place very dear to my heart. I spent 7 years there altogether, and I know every inch of that country, and I've gone back regularly. So I always long to get back to Scotland.
Well, I envy you. I'm 85 now, and I don't think I'm going to make it. But thank you for your remarks. I truly enjoyed this.
Thank you, Tony.
Janice.
Thank you. This has been really great. Thank you so much. It's fascinating, and it makes me anxious to read your book and to read more Borges. And so I was wondering about how his English was when you were with him, and whether you spoke any Spanish, and whether that had any influence on his use of language with you, because often people use different languages in different ways. And then it also makes me wonder about his influence on you. You were just saying something about you want people to find the magic in reading or in literature. And I wonder whether, especially this book, and I'm thinking about some of the other things you've done, whether you feel as if you are doing magical realism.
Well, magical realism, thank you. Those are great questions. Magical realism is simply describing things very accurately and distinctly. I think that's what I would say. The world is so strange and magical, you can't even make it up. It's just so everything that happens is so beyond describing. So if you can describe the world with any accuracy at all, you're very quickly lifting off into a magical realm. Because our life is a miracle. It's all quite miraculous, the things that happen to us every day of our lives. I'm not sure which part of it was a many-faceted question there. Where would I go?
Well, first, I guess the question of language, whether
language, sure, okay, I got it.
How were you communicating?
Well, Borges, first of all, I had studied some Spanish, so I could hack along in Spanish if I needed to. But mainly, Borges's grandmother was English, and he grew up speaking English. And so although he'd lived his life mostly in Spain or mostly in Argentina, he spoke English in a kind of heavily accented English, but perfect English, okay? So sometimes he was a little difficult quite to follow, but he spoke perfect English. And, he did, and he read so much in English. So that was really not a problem. And, but I do think, but when you read his Spanish, many of my friends who are literary critics say that it's a very peculiar Spanish. It's not like anybody else in Spanish. It's a much more Anglo-Saxon syntax and sense feel in the Spanish itself. So Borges has a very distinct quality in his Spanish, in the Spanish he writes, which suggests that it's a man who really is equally acquainted with the English language. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you.
Maureen, let's unmute you. There we go.
Yeah, I don't have a question. I just have a comment. My sister gave me your book this past year,
Mhm.
and I will tell you, talk about magic. It was the best antidote to everything that's been going on. It made me smile, it made me cry, it made me laugh out loud. And I would suggest if anyone has not read it, get it quickly. It's wonderful.
Oh, well,
Oh, thank you.
you're very welcome. I mean, I've had the most astonishing response to this book. Almost never a day goes by that I don't get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 emails from readers around the world out of the blue saying, thank you so much because I laughed so hard, I cried, it's transporting. You're on a magic carpet when you get into this book.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
that's what I was trying to do. You get on a magic carpet and you just flow along. It's great. So
Yeah.
I feel lucky. I feel like the book was given to me. I've sometimes struggled with books, worked on them for years. Nothing much happens. And as I said, I sat down and wrote this book in 3 or 4 months because it just came flooding out. And I almost have no memory of having written it. I really can't. I don't know. It just came to me in the strangest way. So it was like a given to me. I felt really lucky that I was able to write this damn book.
It's definitely a gift to us. Definitely. Thank you.
It's very sweet to say that, Maureen. I appreciate it. I really do.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to say something or comment or ask a question?
Okay. Do you, apart from the people that you know and work with, do you have any favorite authors that you would talk about? Yeah, I'll ask that. Then I'll ask something else. Yeah.
I sometimes think I'm awfully boring because I keep going back to like Robert Frost, over and over again. Frost just draws me to him again and again. I spent years working on his biography, actually off and on for 25 years. I started writing that biography of Frost in 1975, and I finished it in about 2000. That's 25 years of off and on working on that book, sometimes intensely, sometimes it was on the back burner. But Frost is someone that I keep returning to. I return to T.S. Eliot a lot. I return to Wallace Stevens. I read a lot of the great poets. Recently, I did go dive back into Shakespeare. I was reading Shakespeare again. And so, I'm reading around a lot of authors all the time. But I have my favorites. At a certain age, I think reading gives way to rereading. And I like going back to something familiar. Yeah.
Well, I got interested again with Colin McCann, and I don't know if you've read Colin McCann.
I have, yes, I know Colin McCann's
Just
work.
find him. I'm someone that I've gone back to and liked a lot. The other question I have is, do you tell me about, I called you a patriot, maybe that's an exaggeration. I would say you're a good citizen. Do you want to say anything about that aspect of your being?
Well, since the Vietnam War, I've been highly involved in politics because I think we have a responsibility if we see that our government is charging overseas with taxpayer dollars and doing things that really we don't consider ethical or appropriate. And that was the case with the Vietnam War. And I was strongly opposed to the Iraq War because that struck me as another absurd waste of treasure
Mhm.
and life and talent. And when you think of the trillions of dollars that were wasted just to disrupt the Middle East in a way that's still trying to recover from, all of the trouble in Syria and all the trouble with ISIS just followed naturally like the night to day from the initial invasion of Baghdad. So, you could see this thing coming from a long way off. And, it was both predictable and predicted. And so I've been, if you look at over the years now, we've had such dreadful stuff going on in this country. Civil rights in this country has recently obsessed me as it has everybody, because when you look at the terrible history of slavery that that we're endlessly recovering from, and then the Jim Crow era, oh my God, which keeps rearing its ugly head
Look, yeah.
again and again and again. And I've been working on something lately about the Native Americans. And, when you think that what this country looked like before the Puritans got here, you had over 500 Native American tribes living in relative peace. Occasionally there were conflicts, but they had ambassadors. They had ways of dealing with each other. They had, the buffalo hunting in the West and agriculture and hunting and tremendously low impact on the nature. Very deeply religious, interesting cultures, a variety of cultures. But there was a vast civilization here on a high level in operation when these rather barbarous Puritans arrived in 1620 on the Mayflower. So in some ways, and then the story of the killing of so many Native American Indians. It's one of my students recently said, "This isn't a country; it's a crime scene," and that's an exaggeration. But I think we have to somehow accept and come to terms with the fact that yes, the American Revolution was quite remarkable. Our Constitution is quite brilliant. It's an Enlightenment document, but we have a long way to go before we can realize those amazing ideals. And we have so many wackos running around this country with ideas of liberty, which are completely primitive. And every person's freedom comes at the expense of someone else's freedom. So I write for CNN, Salon.com. I do a lot of political pieces. I've been a proponent of gun control for a very long time. The first piece I ever wrote, published, was about gun control. When I was 16 years old, it was published in the Scranton Times. That's my first piece of published writing, was a diatribe about gun control in 1964. So this is, a lifelong obsession with mine. This misreading of the Second Amendment has been so devastating. The reading of the Second Amendment, such as was reaffirmed by Heller a few years ago, is really a very recent phenomenon. No one ever thought that the Second Amendment mean anybody can have any weapon they would choose and just go around shooting up at the world. The right to bear arms meant the right to form a militia. That's what it meant. And also, if we're going to be originalists, we should say, what kind of arms were we talking about? Flintlocks? We certainly weren't talking about AR-15s. So there's a lot of absurdity in movement conservatism on the issue of gun control and the guns. We're the laughing stock of the world on gun control. Laughing stock. And we should be. We deserve to be. Well, we probably are at the end here. Don't want to give everybody, Zoom fatigue will now be setting in on people. I figure 1 hour and everybody's eyes begin to fade. and their eyes begin to blur. So unless there's, Allison, anything else?
I don't think so. I don't see any,
Yeah.
so.
See, in the ordinary, what used to be ordinary times, people would have had a little lunch and listened, and they would be
Right. And we would
all
talk
together. Well,
would
what,
talk
but that day will come.
We'll do that
That-
next year. I'll come to Scranton next year in person and we'll sit down,
It's a deal.
have lunch, and we'll talk, okay?
Thanks a lot for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's lovely to touch base in my hometown. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye for now.